The mop handle struck the concrete with a rhythm older than memory. Back and forth across the hangar floor, pushing water and hydraulic fluid into patterns that caught the overhead lights like oil paintings. The man doing the work wore coveralls 2 sizes too large, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with faded ink. An anchor, a set of wings, coordinates that meant something once. His name tag read Santos in block letters, though nobody in the air wing read name tags on janitors. They walked past him the way people walk past furniture. He was 52 years old. He had a daughter in college studying aerospace engineering. He worked the night shift so he could pick her up from school when she was younger, back when school pickups mattered. Now he worked nights because that's when they'd let him stay, when the hangar belonged to ghosts and fluorescent hum, and the smell of jet fuel that never quite left the air no matter how much degreaser he used. The colonel appeared at 200 hours. She moved through the hangar like weather, not rushed, but inevitable. Her flight suit was darker than the others, worn in places that suggested more hours in a cockpit than behind a desk. She carried a folded flag under one arm, the kind they give families, the kind that comes with words nobody remembers 5 minutes after the ceremony ends. She stopped 3 feet from where Santos worked, waited until he noticed her shadow crossing his mop path, then met his eyes when he looked up. She didn't ask if he had a minute. She didn't apologize for interrupting. She held out the flag with both hands like an offering at an altar neither of them had chosen to attend. "This belonged to Captain Alina Reyes," the colonel said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who'd said these words before, who'd learned that emotion makes them harder to finish. "KIA, Syria, 2 weeks ago. Close air support mission protecting a convoy that got hit outside Deir ez-Zor. She put her A-10 between a Russian gunship and a SEAL team that would have been slaughtered without her." Santos took the flag. His hands were wet from the mop, and he wiped them on his coveralls before accepting it, leaving dark streaks on the fabric that looked like camouflage. The flag was heavier than it should have been. They always were. "Why are you giving this to me?" His voice sounded like it had traveled through sand. The colonel's expression didn't change. "Because 16 years ago, you taught her how to fly." The C-130 lifted from Al Dafra Air Base just before dawn, carrying Santos and 7 other civilians toward something the briefing officer called a recognition ceremony, without explaining what there was left to recognize. They flew low over the Persian Gulf, low enough to see fishing boats cutting white lines through water the color of steel. Santos sat in webbed seating that dug into his spine, the folded flag resting on his lap like a sleeping child. Across from him, a woman in her 30s kept checking her phone even though there was no signal at altitude. A man in an expensive suit slept with his mouth open. Nobody talked. The cargo master moved through the cabin checking tie-downs on equipment nobody had bothered to explain, his movements practiced and indifferent. They landed at an airfield Santos didn't recognize, somewhere in Jordan based on the mountains visible through the porthole windows. The heat hit like a physical force when the ramp dropped, dry, aggressive, the kind that made your eyes water and your throat close. A captain with MP brassard met them on the tarmac, checked names against a roster on a clipboard, then loaded them into a bus with windows too dirty to see through clearly. They drove for 40 minutes through landscape that looked like God had given up halfway through making it. Tan dirt, tan rocks, tan sky where the dust hadn't settled yet from whatever convoy had passed through earlier. The ceremony took place in a hangar that looked exactly like the one Santos cleaned back home. Same fluorescent lights, same oil stains, same hollow acoustics that made every word echo 3 times. Except this hangar held an A-10 Thunderbolt II that looked like it had been through a war. The aircraft sat in the center of the space like a wounded animal that refused to lie down. Its titanium bathtub cockpit was scorched black in places. The port engine cowling showed impact damage, large caliber rounds, maybe 23, the kind that would have killed anything without the A-10's redundant systems and armored protection. The starboard wing had been patched with fresh aluminum that hadn't been painted yet. The nose art was still visible under the carbon scoring, a cartoon fairy holding a GAU-8 Avenger cannon, and beneath it in careful script, Whisper. Call sign Whisper. Santos remembered teaching Alina to fly when she was 16 years old, back when he still had a pilot's license and hope, and a reason to believe that showing a kid how to handle a Cessna 172 might matter. She'd been quiet, methodical, the kind of student who wrote everything down and asked questions that revealed she'd been thinking 3 steps ahead while he was still explaining step 1. She'd shown up every Saturday for 2 years, paying for lessons with money she made working at a movie theater, arriving with grease under her nails from the popcorn machine and determination in her eyes that made him believe maybe this world wasn't completely lost. When she'd soloed for the first time, she'd greeted him on the tarmac afterward with a silence so profound, he'd understood that some kinds of joy don't need words. That's when the other students had started calling her Whisper. The call sign had followed her through civilian certification, through the Air Force Academy, through fighter training, all the way to an A-10 squadron stationed at Davis-Monthan, where the desert went on forever, and the warthogs flew low and mean over ranges that simulated wars everyone knew were coming. The briefing officer was a major with intel insignia and the bearing of someone who'd never met Alina but had studied her mission reports like sacred texts. He stood beside a projection screen showing satellite imagery of Syrian desert, buildings reduced to geometric shapes, roads to thin gray lines. He used a laser pointer to indicate positions while he talked about the mission in the passive voice, as though violence was something that happened rather than something people chose. The convoy had been ambushed at a checkpoint. Small arms fire, RPGs, then the Russian Mi-28 appearing from the north like a message from a different kind of war. The SEALs had been pinned, taking casualties, calling for anything that could fly, when Whisper had arrived with her A-10's distinctive engine howl that sounded like the sky tearing itself apart. Santos listened to the major describe what Alina had done with the clinical detachment of an after-action report, how she'd entered a holding pattern above the convoy, drawing fire to identify enemy positions, how she'd made 6-gun runs with her 30 cannon, each pass bringing her lower, closer, more exposed, how the Russian helicopter had engaged her with air-to-air missiles, and she defeated them with flares, and flying that the major described as exceptional in the same tone, someone might say adequate. How on the 7th pass, with her aircraft already damaged and warning lights illuminating her cockpit like a Christmas tree, she'd put herself between the Mi-28 and the SEAL team long enough for the extraction birds to arrive. How the Russian helicopter had broken off only after hitting her with cannon fire that should have brought her down immediately. How she'd nursed the A-10 40 nautical miles back toward friendly territory before the port engine had finally quit and the flight controls had degraded beyond recovery. How she kept her aircraft flying long enough to aim it away from a village, away from the roads, into empty desert where the only casualty would be herself. The major didn't mention that she'd been 28 years old. He didn't mention that 3 days before the mission, she'd sent her mother a text saying she was tired but okay. He didn't mention that she'd volunteered for the alert duty that put her in position to respond when the SEALs called for help, or that 2 other pilots had been available but she'd been closer and faster and willing. He didn't mention any of this because none of it appeared in the after-action report, and if it wasn't in the report then officially it hadn't happened. What he did mention was that 6 SEALs were alive because of her. He showed their photos on the screen, 6 men in their 20s and 30s, faces tanned and worn, eyes that had seen things they'd never talk about. He said their names like a roll call, but Santos didn't write them down. He was too busy staring at the A-10 in the center of the hangar, at the burn marks and the patched wing and the nose art that some maintainer had preserved, because even mechanics understand that some things are holy. After the briefing, they were given time to approach the aircraft. Santos walked toward it slowly, the flag still folded in his hands. Up close, the damage was more severe than it had appeared from the briefing chairs. The canopy had been replaced, The original had been shattered by shrapnel. The ejection seat showed scoring where fire had touched it. Inside the cockpit, someone had left a photograph taped to the instrument panel. Alina, at maybe 10 years old, standing beside the same Cessna 172 Santos had taught her in, grinning with gap-toothed joy and one hand resting on the propeller like she was making a promise. He recognized the photo because he'd taken it, back when he still believed that teaching people to fly was the same thing as keeping them safe. A voice behind him said, "You're the one who taught her." Not a question. Santos turned to find one of the SEALs from the photographs, early 30s, scar tissue visible on his neck above his dress uniform collar, eyes that seemed to be looking at something slightly to the left of the present moment. His name tag read Morrison. He stood at a distance that suggested respect for grief he didn't want to intrude on, but his presence carried weight, the kind that comes from needing to say something before the opportunity passes forever. "She saved my life," Morrison said quietly, "saved all of us. We were taking fire from 3 sides pinned against a wall that was coming apart around us. Jenkins was hit, chest wound, arterial. We thought we were going to lose him right there. Then we heard the cannon, 30 Mike unmistakable, sounds like the end of the world coming down the pipe. She made 6 runs, maybe 7, every pass closer than the last. The Russian helo was hunting her, firing missiles we could see from the ground, and she just kept coming back. When the Pave Hawks finally got us out, she was still up there, still covering us even though her aircraft was trailing smoke. Last thing I heard on the radio was her telling the flight lead she had it under control. Voice calm as Sunday morning. Then she was gone." Santos didn't respond immediately. He kept his eyes on the photograph in the cockpit, on the little girl who'd wanted nothing more than to fly, who'd worked at a movie theater and shown up every Saturday smelling like popcorn butter and possibility. The flag in his hands felt heavier than physics allowed. "She was quiet," he finally said. "Even as a kid. Didn't talk much, but when she did, you listened. She asked me once why I taught flying lessons when I could have done something that paid better. I told her because flying was the only thing I'd ever done that felt like it mattered. She looked at me like she understood something I hadn't said. 16 years old, and she already knew what it meant to matter." Morrison nodded slowly. "She got us out, all of us. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Santos said, "but it doesn't make her less dead." The recognition ceremony happened at noon, with full military honors and a chaplain who didn't know Alina but spoke about sacrifice with the rehearsed sincerity of someone who'd given this speech before. They presented medals to people who weren't there to receive them. They played taps on a bugle that echoed through the hangar like sorrow given musical form. Santos stood in formation with the other civilians, holding the flag that was his to keep now, watching officers salute an empty space where Alina should have been standing. The SEALs stood together off to one side, 6 men who carried the weight of being alive when someone else wasn't, and Santos understood that they'd carry that weight for the rest of their lives, that knowing you were saved doesn't make you feel saved. It makes you feel like you're borrowing time that belonged to someone else. Afterward, the colonel who'd given him the flag approached again. Her name tag read Vance. She carried herself with the controlled exhaustion of someone who'd been in command long enough to understand that command meant living with decisions you couldn't unmake. "Walk with me," she said, and it wasn't a request. They left the hangar, moving into sunlight that felt aggressive after the artificial cool of the ceremony. The airfield stretched in all directions, fighter jets on alert pads, transport aircraft being loaded, the controlled chaos of a forward operating base that never really slept. Vance led him toward a memorial wall on the edge of the flight line, a long concrete structure covered with names and dates and photographs of airmen who'd been killed in action. Alina's photograph had already been added, her official portrait, dress blues, expression serious, but somehow still carrying that quiet determination Santos remembered from when she was 16. "I knew her," Vance said, stopping in front of the memorial. "Had her in my squadron for 8 months before she transferred to the A-10 unit. Best pilot I ever saw in a cockpit. Not the flashiest, not the one who'd win any aerobatic competitions, but the one you wanted on your wing when things went bad. She had this ability to stay calm when everyone else was losing their shit. We called her Whisper partly because she was quiet, but mostly because when she talked on the radio during combat, her voice never changed. Same tone whether she was ordering coffee or calling in a danger-close gun run. It was unsettling until you realized it meant she was never panicking, never guessing, never anything except completely in control. Santos looked at the photograph. Alina's eyes stared back with the particular intensity of military portraits, the kind that try to capture professionalism, but often reveal something deeper. Determination, maybe, or the understanding that wearing the uniform means accepting that control is sometimes an illusion. "Why did you bring me here?" he asked. She had family, mother in Texas, brother in the Navy. Why give the flag to the guy who taught her to fly 20 years ago? Vance was quiet for a long moment, her eyes scanning the memorial wall as though reading names she'd memorized long ago. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she'd been thinking about this answer for days. "Because her mother told me to. 3 days ago, after we notified her, after she finished crying, after she'd pulled herself together enough to ask questions, she asked about you, asked if you knew. When I said I didn't know where you were, she found you. Called the base, tracked you down, insisted we bring you here. She said Alina talked about you, said you were the reason she flew, said you gave her something that mattered when she needed to know that things could matter." Santos felt something crack in his chest, a pressure that had been building since the moment Vance had handed him the flag back in the hangar at Al Dafra. He looked away from the memorial wall, toward the flight line where an F-16 was taxiing for takeoff, its engine howl cutting through the afternoon heat. "I was a better pilot than I am a janitor," he said quietly. "Lost my license 12 years ago. DUI. Lost my job, lost my marriage, lost everything except a daughter who somehow still answered my calls. Started working nights cleaning hangars because it was the only way I could still be around aircraft, still smell the fuel and hear the engines and pretend I was still part of something. Alina didn't know any of that. Last time I saw her was her first solo flight. After that, she moved on, joined the Air Force, became everything I'd stopped being. I figured she'd forgotten." "She didn't forget," Vance said. "She kept that photograph in her cockpit through 3 deployments, the one of her standing next to the Cessna when she was 10. Her mother said she'd look at it before every mission, like a reminder of why she started flying in the first place." The F-16 rotated, lifting into the sky with the kind of power that makes physics look negotiable. Santos watched it climb, watched it bank toward whatever mission justified burning that much fuel, and felt the familiar ache of being grounded, not just physically, but existentially, permanently separated from the thing that had once defined him. "She was better than me," he said. "Better than I ever was. She flew with purpose. I flew because I didn't know what else to do." Vance turned to face him directly. "You taught her. That matters. She saved 6 men because you taught her that flying was something that mattered. That's not nothing, Santos. That's legacy." Legacy. The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and explosive. Santos looked at the flag in his hands, at the precise folds that turned fabric into symbol, and understood that he was being offered something. Not forgiveness, exactly, but permission to believe that his failure wasn't the end of the story, that the thing he'd lost might have passed through him into someone who'd used it better, someone who'd proven that skill without purpose was just motion, but skill with purpose was salvation. The return flight to Al Dafra was quieter than the one out. Santos sat in the same webbed seat, the flag still on his lap, but now it felt different, not lighter, but somehow more settled, as though it had accepted its weight and learned to carry itself. Morrison sat across from him, the SEAL who'd survived because Alina had flown herself into hell to pull him out. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in the silence between ceremony and departure. in the space where people who'd been touched by the same death tried to figure out what being alive required from them now. Back in the States, Santos returned to work. Same hangar, same mop, same hydraulic fluid and fluorescent lights and the smell of jet fuel that never left. But something had changed. The pilots who walked past him now sometimes nodded. Morrison had apparently talked, had told the story of the A-10 pilot who'd saved his team, and somehow word had spread that the janitor in Bay 3 had taught her to fly. Santos didn't confirm or deny it. He just kept mopping, kept pushing water and oil into patterns that caught the light, kept showing up for the night shift because that's what you did when you'd been given a second chance you didn't deserve and couldn't refuse. One night 2 months after the ceremony, a young lieutenant found him near the maintenance pit. She was new, fresh out of flight school, carrying a helmet bag and the particular nervous energy of someone about to fly their first night sortie. She stopped beside where Santos was working, waited until he noticed her, then spoke in a voice that hadn't yet learned how to hide uncertainty. "You taught Whisper," she said, "not a question." Santos straightened, leaning on the mop handle. "Long time ago. I heard about what she did, Syria, the SEAL team. We studied the mission in our tactics class. Instructor said it was perfect close air support, disciplined, focused, effective. Said she flew like someone who understood that precision was the same thing as compassion." The lieutenant paused, adjusted her grip on the helmet bag. "I'm about to fly my first combat mission. Deployment starts next month. I'm scared I'm going to fuck it up. That when things go bad I'm going to freeze or panic or get someone killed because I wasn't good enough." Santos looked at her, 23, maybe 24, eyes bright with fear and determination and the terrible responsibility of knowing that lives would depend on her decisions. He thought about Alina at 16, standing beside a Cessna with grease under her nails and questions in her eyes. He thought about the photograph in the cockpit, the gap-toothed grin, the hand on the propeller making a promise to herself. He thought about Morrison's voice saying, "She got us out," and Vance saying, "That's legacy," and the weight of the flag that sat in his apartment now, folded and framed and hung on a wall where he could see it every morning before work. "You're going to be scared," he said quietly. "That's good. Fear means you understand what's at stake. But when you're in the cockpit, when people are counting on you, the fear becomes something else. It becomes focus." Alina understood that. She flew scared every mission, but she flew anyway, and she flew perfect because she knew that perfect was the only thing worth doing when lives were on the line. You want to honor her, fly like that. Fly scared, but fly perfect. Make every pass count. Bring everyone home. The lieutenant nodded slowly, something settling in her expression. "Thank you," she said, and walked toward her aircraft. Santos went back to mopping. The hangar floor stretched ahead of him, endless and familiar, reflecting lights like stars in oil. Above him, through the open bay doors, he could see the night sky, clear, vast, filled with aircraft on approach and departure, their navigation lights tracing paths through darkness that looked almost like hope. Somewhere up there, pilots were training, were flying, were carrying the weight of responsibility that turned skill into service and service into something that might, if you squinted right and believed hard enough, look like redemption. He pushed the mop in steady strokes, the rhythm older than memory, the motion identical to yesterday and tomorrow and all the days that stretched behind and ahead. But now when pilots walked past, some of them saw him. Some of them nodded. Some of them knew that the man cleaning the hangar had taught Whisper to fly, and that Whisper had saved lives, and that maybe, just maybe, the janitor sweeping hydraulic fluid into patterns that caught the light was part of a story that didn't end with failure, but transformed it into something else, something that flew on borrowed wings into battles he'd never see, protecting people he'd never meet, carrying forward a legacy built from one quiet girl's determination and one broken pilot's last good lesson. The night stretched on and Santos worked through it, and overhead the aircraft kept flying, and that was enough. That had to be enough. That was everything.